Earlier, we discussed Nintendo's debut into the field of electronics through their beam gun in 1970. Well, we're now entering the first of three 1985 titles that utilize the same technology, the light gun series. But before we delve into Duck Hunt, let's briefly talk about the NES Zapper's place in this whole equation. The NES Deluxe set and pre-deluxe test market set before the official launch of the console in 1986 came bundled with Gyromite, Duck Hunt, Rob the Robot, and a Zapper. While we've already talked about the importance of Rob, there's another piece of the puzzle that I left out. It's been well established that Nintendo was doing anything they could to distance themselves from the word video game. Rob did a great job of this by pulling the focus towards the toy aspect of the system. The Zapper was the second line of defense. While the gun was used for quite a few different games that certainly aged a lot better than Rob's releases, it was also portrayed as a toy gun that could be used with the power of imagination in several commercials that aired at the time. It was never far from its robot brother, really attempting to highlight the futuristic aspect of the NES. By turning the consumer's attention away from the console and towards the new and exciting peripherals, something only a few video game consoles had done, and typically just as a gimmick, Nintendo was really selling the interactive aspect of the system. This, however, was far from the only benefit that the Zapper afforded them. We've talked about the financial dilemmas Nintendo faced when launching their console overseas, but a key part of the difficulty they encountered came in the form of cultural differences. This was the 1980s. Those who served in World War II had a major influence in all American markets, and Japan being the first nation that attacked American soil had certainly not left their memories. Anti-Japanese sentiment was still widely prevalent, exacerbated by the moving of one of America's biggest markets, automobile production, overseas to Japan, which had been producing much more fuel-efficient cars than Detroit. Nintendo had their work cut out for them. They had to work their way into the hearts of Americans before they'd get a chance at their wallets. While Nintendo began their overseas presence in 1979 with the opening of their New York offices, they had been steadily building up a presence in America, coming to a head with the success of their arcade cabinets starting in 1981. They had developed distribution branches for these arcade cabinets, the popular Game & Watch handheld devices, and their many toys and gadgets by the early 80s, spearheaded by Minoru Arakawa, the first president of Nintendo of America. Although the headquarters, and with it the final decisions, remained squarely in Nintendo's hometown of Kyoto, the intricacies of marketing to American audiences was made up of just a few employees in the States. Nintendo of America didn't have many people working for them yet. Outside of Arakawa, they had Howard Lincoln, the vice president, Howard Phillips, a warehouse manager, and Gail Tilden, the advertising manager, and these three were often consulted for their opinions on what to launch the NES with. Howard recalled being presented with a list of Famicom games and writing down which he thought would best fit in a presentation he gave at CGE 2012.
And then we needed games for it. So Mr. Arakawa came in and said, well, by then there was about 40 games available in Famicom in Japan. He said, so which games should we release? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, we want a range of games. We need about, a dozen, 18, something like that. Which games do you think? So I wrote up a list and wrote up my reasons for all of that. Again, I'm just a warehouse guy, but I've been running the route and doing all that stuff.
The Nintendo of America team also played an important part in changing the NES's design to fit with the American market, and concocted many of their most successful advertising campaigns. These groups had to determine what games would fit into the culture of America, represented by the products shipping alongside the NES for its test market debut. Rob had already been determined as a must-have choice, but something was missing. Wait a second. What do Americans love? Oh yeah, guns. Including the Zapper was a no-brainer, but deciding what game to pair it with would prove no easy task. When reviewing the sales data from the Nintendo Versus system, which utilized light guns for Wild Gunman, Duck Hunt, and Hogan's Alley, it was clear that Duck Hunt was the winner in terms of popularity. And so it was ultimately decided to ship the test market system with none other than Duck Hunt. Duck Hunt was a fairly standard point-and-shoot title, but its easy accessibility and many quirks certainly won at the hearts of Americans, both within its testing phase with the Versus system and its official 1985 release. It was produced by Intelligent Systems and directed by Shigeru Miyamoto, whose influence can be felt throughout the wacky character design and casual gameplay. The game consisted of 3 modes: 1 duck, 2 duck, red duck, and blue duck. And clay shooter. Game A's 1 duck served as the intro to the game as a whole. The player's dog would sniff around on screen and jump into the bushes, accompanied by a dog woof sample, which, considering the NES's limited sound capabilities, was quite impressive for the time. Ducks would periodically fly out of the brush, and the player would have 3 attempts to hit them before they flew away. If they missed, the dog would tease the player with a laugh, making fun of them for being a poor shot. Looking at the blurb given to Duck Hunt on the back of its box shows us that this humor was actually a major selling point of the game. If you miss, even your dog laughs at you. Although the player's canine companion was, at the end of the day, a helper, it may be that Nintendo overshot the obnoxiousness of the character, landing slightly farther than silly and into the frustrating camp. However, the Nintendo-style humanization of their characters, not often seen in the prior years when video games were intended to be a serious alternative to other media forms, certainly stuck. It's true players from this era grew to loathe the dog, but it's undeniable that this contributed to the unforgettableness of the game. The 2-duck mode was intended for players who had a little bit more experience under their belt. 2 ducks would fly up from the brush at a time, and if there was a second player, they'd control one of the ducks, intending to make life as difficult as possible for the shooter. This was a refreshing take on the classic 2-player game modes, where, typically, the second player would just take over the controls and try to beat the first player's high score, but the bar for interactivity was pretty low. Game C's Clay Shooting was the 3rd and final game mode, forgoing any ducks and instead serving as a skeet shooting simulator. This mode didn't have the personality of the first 2, notably lacking the dog, but was intended to be the ultimate challenge of Duck Hunt, at least according to the advertising. While Duck Hunt was certainly a solid light gun title, it did lack some of the depth present in Hogan's Alley. However, its choice as a pack-in, even after the end of the test market and deluxe sets print runs, certainly show how ingrained the game was in the NES's life. It famously came on a double cart with Super Mario Bros. And later on a triple cart with Mario and World Class Track Meet. It appeared in another console bundle, the NES Action Set, and would continue to be promoted well beyond Rob's last breath. Even if there weren't many light gun games made for the NES, Nintendo's insistence on continuing its production all the way into 1994 makes sense with the intense legacy it left. There are still 2 other 1985 Zapper games to cover, unless I will leave my light gun legacy till the end of the series. But, for now, I'll go over some of the influence Duck Hunt itself had on future titles. It's difficult to understate how iconic the Duck Hunt dog is. Besides the one-off cameos in other NES titles, such as Barker Bill's Trick Shooting, he notably got his own character in Super Smash Bros. For 3DS and Wii U. His smugness has even led to many fan theories of potentially nefarious origins, culminating in Duck Season, the 2017 VR indie horror title. This game comes from an era of indie horror in the mid-2010s, working off the trend of nostalgia horror brought on by the hit game Five Nights at Freddy's. This adaptation of the dog to an entirely new genre 4 decades after his initial debut speaks to the immense cultural impact that he had. In terms of gameplay, while far from the first point-and-shoot arcade-style title using a gun peripheral, Duck Hunt was one of the best of its time. Nintendo ended up making another light gun peripheral for the Super Nintendo, called the Super Scope. Super Scope 6, its first game, was also developed by Intelligent Systems, and was a massive step up from Duck Hunt in nearly all aspects of gameplay, sound design, and graphics. Mole Patrol, a minigame, seems to be heavily inspired by Duck Hunt, from its colorful character design to its use of small woodland creatures as targets. In 2006, similar to how Wii Sports took many concepts from the black box sports titles and repurposed them as mini tech demos for those new to video games, Wii Play was another side of the coin, taking casual activities and turning them into games for the whole family to enjoy. The first game in the bunch, Shooting Range, starts with a flurry of familiar-looking ducks flying out of some bushes. In fact, the whole first stage is incredibly reminiscent of Duck Hunt, albeit without the game over screens or the rude dog. While shooting targets or balloons, the player may hear a dog woof, after which a duck shoots across the screen, granting the player bonus points if shot down. In Wii Play Motion, a 3D version of this concept is implemented, showing off the new and improved Wii Play Motion Plus of the Wii Remote in 2011. With Duck Hunt, Nintendo created a simple game that would remain relevant as a standalone title years after its launch, something that can't be said about most black box games. The playfulness of the environment and wacky character designs of Miyamoto set the foundations that many later point-and-shoot titles would build off of. Even by today's standards, if one can find a CRT and a Zapper, Duck Hunt aged quite gracefully. It may not be the deepest of light gun games, but it certainly is the most iconic.